The mahogany dining table was set for two, the ambient light reflecting off crystal wine glasses in Alexandra's meticulously curated suburban home. But the manila envelope resting beside the floral centerpiece bore no return address, only a foreclosure notice signed by a holding company she didn't recognize, sealed with a familiar metallic emblem her husband used to wear before he vanished without a word 5 years ago. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a secret finally catching up to you, a quiet that consumes everything in its path. If stories of hidden betrayals, the heavy cost of ambition, and the devastating quiet of revenge resonate with you, stay with me. There are many more secrets waiting behind these closed doors, and you won't want to miss how they unfold. The hum of the refrigerator in the cramped Logan Square apartment had always been a comforting sound to Hunter Anderson. It was the white noise of a simple, predictable life. But tonight at 2:15 a.m., it sounded like a ticking clock. Hunter stood in the narrow hallway, the faint lingering scent of talcum powder, barbicide, and sandalwood still clinging to his knuckles. 10 hours on his feet at Style Cuts barbershop usually guaranteed a dreamless, heavy sleep, the kind of exhaustion that anchored a man to his mattress. Yet he was wide awake. In the dim light spilling from the street lamps outside, he looked into the bedroom. Alexandra was asleep, the soft rise and fall of her chest the only movement in the room. Even in the shadowy dark, she looked immaculate. Alexandra Pemberton never just slept. She posed. Her silken nightgown, a recent, expensive purchase, she claimed she had saved up for, draped perfectly over her shoulder. She belonged in a penthouse overlooking the skyline, not in a second-floor walk-up, where the L train rattled the window panes every 20 minutes. She had spent the last 2 years subtly reminding him of that fact. The glow began on the nightstand. It wasn't a ring, just the silent, insistent illumination of a screen waking up. Once, twice. Hunter wouldn't have looked. He had never been a man poisoned by jealousy, but the phone vibrated against the edge of the glass water cup, threatening to fall. He stepped into the room, intending only to push it to safety. His thumb brushed the screen. A notification hung in the center, bright and devastating. David Miller, still thinking about this afternoon. The hotel lobby smelled like your perfume. Tell him you're working late tomorrow again. Hunter didn't drop the phone. He didn't gasp. His calloused thumb hovered over the glowing text as the words burned themselves into his retinas. David Miller, the name tasted like ash. David, the senior VP of some downtown hedge fund. David, the man who came into Style Cuts every 2 weeks for a hot towel shave, who tipped generously with a condescending smile, who asked Hunter about his little life while getting his neck lined up. A sudden suffocating clarity washed over Hunter. It explained the late nights at her marketing firm. It explained the sudden aversion to his touch, the way her eyes slid past his whenever they sat at the dinner table. She hadn't been looking past him. She had been looking towards someone else. He looked back at Alexandra. She shifted in her sleep, a soft sigh escaping her lips. There was no guilt etched on her beautiful features. No remorse. She was sleeping the peaceful sleep of a woman who believed she had flawlessly compartmentalized her life, the comfortable, reliable husband at home, and the wealthy, thrilling lover in the city. In the movies, this was the part where the husband threw a lamp against the wall, where he screamed until his voice gave out, demanding tears, demanding an explanation. But Hunter felt entirely hollowed out, as if his internal organs had been replaced by freezing water. An explanation wouldn't change the hotel lobby. It wouldn't erase David Miller's arrogant smirk in the barber chair. Hunter set the phone down gently, exactly where he found it. He walked to the small closet near the front door and pulled down his faded canvas duffel bag. Methodically, silently, he began to pack. 3 pairs of jeans, a handful of shirts, his clippers and his favorite shears in their leather case. He moved like a ghost in his own home. He didn't take the television they bought together. He didn't take the photographs off the mantle. When the bag was zipped, Hunter walked into the kitchen. He slid the plain gold band off his left ring finger. The metal was warm, but it felt remarkably heavy as he placed it on the Formica countertop right next to the unpaid electricity bill. He didn't look back at the bedroom. He simply opened the front door, stepped out into the biting Chicago wind, and closed it behind him with a soft final click. The morning sun over Lake Forest did not merely shine, it curated. It poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 6-bedroom estate, catching the sharp angles of the Calicotta Marble Island and the flawless polish of the imported hardwood floors. Alexandra Pemberton stood at the center of the vast kitchen, holding a cup of espresso she wasn't drinking. 5 years had refined her. Gone were the sensible blouses she used to wear on the L train. Now she was draped in a cashmere lounge set that cost more than her former husband's monthly salary. Her reflection in the stainless steel double oven was picture perfect, the affluent, sophisticated wife of a successful finance executive. Yet the air in the massive house felt noticeably thin. From down the hall, the heavy oak door of David's study clicked open. Alexandra turned, arranging her features into a pleasant, practiced mask. David emerged, his tie already loosened, the sleeves of his $2,000 suit rolled up to the elbows. He didn't possess the same effortless arrogance that had charmed her half a decade ago. The sharp, confident lines of his face had softened into a perpetual scowl, and his eyes carried the bruised look of a man who hadn't slept deeply in months. "The landscaping crew is here," Alexandra murmured, keeping her voice light, conversational. "I told them to focus on the hydrangeas near the south gate. We have the country club dinner next weekend, and the Wilsons will be driving past." David walked past her, barely registering her presence, and opened the refrigerator. He bypassed the carafe of fresh juice and pulled out a bottle of sparkling water, his hands moving with a jerky, caffeinated rhythm. "Cancel the landscaping crew," he said flatly, staring at the granite countertop. Alexandra's fingers tightened around her espresso cup. The porcelain felt suddenly cold. "Cancel then, David, the yard is half done. It will look completely unkempt." "I said cancel them, Alexandra." His voice dropped an octave, a quiet, dangerous shift that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. He finally looked at her, and there was a hollow, frantic energy behind his gaze. "We don't need to pay a small fortune for a bunch of dead bushes this month. Just do it." Before she could form a rebuttal, the heavy brass slot of the front door clattered, signaling the arrival of the morning mail. In the past, mail delivery was a trivial event: invitations, fashion catalogs, perhaps a note from an old college friend. Now it was a daily tension. David brushed past her, his heavy footsteps echoing in the cavernous foyer. Alexandra followed at a distance, watching as he scooped up the thick stack of envelopes from the Persian runner. She saw the flash of red ink on several envelopes before he hastily flipped them over. Final notice, overdue. He shoved the letters into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, his jaw clenched tight. "Is everything all right with the accounts?" she asked, her voice faltering. Just a fraction. It was the dangerous question, the one they implicitly agreed never to ask. David stopped halfway out the front door. He didn't turn around. His knuckles were white where he gripped the brass handle. "Everything is fine. It's just a liquidity issue, a market correction. Don't worry your pretty head about it." He stepped out into the crisp morning air, leaving her alone in the immense quiet foyer. Through the sidelight windows, she watched his luxury SUV tear out of the circular driveway tires, kicking up pristine white gravel. Alexandra walked back to the kitchen, the silence of the house pressing down on her shoulders. She had traded a small, honest life for this sprawling estate, convinced she was stepping into a world of limitless security. But as she looked at the empty space where the mail had been, a cold realization began to pool in her stomach. She was living inside a beautiful, fragile glass bubble, and she could hear the glass beginning to crack. The 42nd floor of the monolithic glass tower offered a god's eye view of the Chicago River, but Hunter Anderson rarely looked out the window anymore. He preferred the data on his monitors. Data was clean, data didn't lie, and it certainly didn't leave hotel receipts on a nightstand. Hunter sat at the head of a massive live-edge walnut conference table. The faded denim and smell of barbicide were ghosts of another lifetime. Today he wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit his broad shoulders with architectural precision. His hands, once rough and calloused from years of wielding clippers and straight razors, rested steepled under his chin. They were smooth now, the hands of a man who moved millions of dollars with a keystroke. Across the table sat Sean Murphy. Sean was a veteran of the distressed asset game, a ruthless pragmatist with silver hair and a sharp Boston accent who had recognized a quiet, hungry brilliance in Hunter 5 years ago. Together they had built a private equity firm that specialized in acquiring non-performing residential loans from panicked banks. "The regional banks are bleeding out," Sean said, tapping his Mont Blanc pen against a leather folio. "They're trying to offload these suburban portfolios before the quarter ends. There's a block in the North Shore area, mostly Lake Forest and Winnetka, high net worth individuals who leverage themselves to the hilt on margin calls. The bank wants 30 cents on the dollar. Pull up the ledger. Hunter said, his voice a low, even baritone that commanded the quiet room. Sean projected the spreadsheet onto the massive screen at the end of the room. It was a sea of black text and red negative numbers, rows and columns reducing human lives, their homes, their failures, their desperate attempts to maintain an illusion into simple, digestible data points. Hunter scanned the addresses. Days past due 90, 120, 180. He felt nothing for the names attached to the massive numbers. It was just business, a mathematical equation waiting to be solved. Then his eyes stopped. Row 142. Property address 4,850. Whispering Pines Lane, Lake Forest. Principal balance $4.2 million. Days past due 155. Hunter's gaze drifted slowly to the adjacent column. Borrowers Miller David L. / Pemberton Alexandra. The hum of the climate control system seemed to vanish, leaving a vacuum of absolute silence in Hunter's ears. For a fraction of a second, the sterile scent of the boardroom was replaced by the phantom smell of his cramped Logan Square apartment. He saw the flash of a cell phone screen in the dark. He felt the heavy dead weight of a gold band sliding off his finger. Hunter. Sean's voice pierced the memory. He looked up from his iPad, frowning slightly at his partner's sudden rigid stillness. You see a red flag on that North Shore block? Hunter stared at the screen. 5 years. He had spent half a decade meticulously building a fortress around himself, brick by agonizing brick, ensuring he would never be powerless again. He had assumed that Alexandra and David were living their gilded, perfect life, entirely immune to consequences. But the red numbers glaring back at him told a different story. They were drowning, and the life preserver belonged to the bank. Slowly, Hunter lowered his hands. A muscle feathered along his jawline. No red flag, Sean. Hunter said softly, his eyes locked on row 142. The hollowness in his chest, a void he had carried for 5 years, suddenly flooded with a dark, freezing purpose. In fact, I think this portfolio is undervalued. Contact the holding bank. Tell them we'll take the entire North Shore block. Sean raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sudden aggressive pivot. The whole block, without a deeper dive into the specific assets. I've seen enough, Hunter replied, his voice devoid of any emotion. He clicked his mouse, turning the screen black. Buy it. The silence of a 10,000-square-foot house was a heavy physical thing. In the late afternoon, as the autumn sun dipped below the tree line, the shadows in the Lake Forest estate stretched long and sharp across the Persian rugs. Alexandra sat in the sunroom, a half-empty glass of Pinot Grigio, warming in her hand, trying to focus on a charity gala invitation. The embossed gold lettering blurred before her eyes. The sharp, jarring chime of the front gate intercom broke the stillness. Alexandra startled, spilling a drop of wine onto her cashmere sleeve. She moved to the security panel in the hallway and pressed the speaker button. A distorted, tinny voice announced a courier delivery requiring a direct signature. Moments later, she stood in the grand foyer, staring at the thick, rigid envelope in her hands. It wasn't the usual soft linen paper of their country club correspondence. It was stark white, heavy, and bore the brutal, unadorned logo of a commercial holding firm she didn't recognize. Certified mail, signature required. She walked back to the kitchen island, her bare feet making no sound on the chilled marble. With a silver letter opener, she sliced the top of the envelope. The paper inside was dense, filled with dense paragraphs of legal typography. Her eyes scanned the page, skipping over the jargon until they locked onto the bolded, capitalized words in the center. Notice of intent to foreclose. Acceleration of debt. Immediate action required. A cold, heavy stone dropped into the pit of Alexandra's stomach. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt too thin to breathe. She read the numbers at the bottom of the page, the principal balance, the accrued penalties, the astronomical sum required to halt the proceedings. It was a figure that defied logic, a number that proved David's dismissive claims of a temporary liquidity issue were not just lies but desperate delusions. The property was in default. The bank was coming for the house. The low mechanical hum of the garage door opening vibrated through the floorboards. David was home early. Panic, sharp and metallic, flooded her veins. She looked at the letter, then toward the hallway leading to the garage. If she confronted him with this now, if she held up the undeniable proof of his failure, The fragile, tense piece of their home would violently detonate. She remembered the frantic, hollow look in his eyes that morning, the way he had snapped over the landscaping. He was a man cornered by his own hubris, and a cornered man was dangerous. The heavy thud of the mudroom door echoed through the house. Footsteps approached. In a fraction of a second, self-preservation overrode her demand for the truth. Alexandra folded the thick document in half, her hands trembling violently, and shoved it to the very bottom of the recycling bin beneath a stack of discarded architectural magazines. She quickly moved to the sink, splashing cold water on her face and taking a long, deep breath to steady her racing heart. When David walked into the kitchen, his tie undone and his jacket slung over one shoulder, she was wiping her hands on a linen towel, projecting the image of perfect, unbothered domesticity. "You're home early," she said, managing a remarkably even tone. David didn't look at her. He walked straight to the liquor cabinet, poured a generous measure of scotch into a crystal tumbler, and drank it neat. "Market closed poorly," he muttered, his voice tight and exhausted. "I need a quiet evening. Don't ask me about it." He walked out of the kitchen, taking the bottle with him, and headed toward his study. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, the lock engaging with a final decisive snap. Alexandra stood alone in the pristine kitchen, the ambient hum of the refrigerator the only sound left. She looked down at the recycling bin, knowing what lay buried beneath the glossy pages. The house was no longer a sanctuary, it was a sinking ship, and for the first time in her life, she was entirely trapped, suffocating under the weight of a secret she couldn't afford to keep but was too terrified to reveal. The scent of warm shaving cream and sharp astringent was a time machine. Sitting in his sterile glass-walled office, Hunter closed his eyes, and suddenly, the ambient hum of the 42nd floor dissolved into the rhythmic, metallic buzz of Andis clippers. It was a Friday evening, roughly 6 years ago. The neon style-cut sign buzzed faintly against the rain-slicked window overlooking State Street. Hunter had been on his feet for 9 hours, his lower back radiating a dull, familiar ache. Sitting in the leather waiting chairs near the coat rack was Alexandra. She was reading a fashion magazine, her pristine presence elevating the worn checkered floor aesthetic of the shop. She always came in on Fridays to wait for him to close out his register, a ritual he had once believed was born of devotion. The bell above the door chimed. David Miller walked in, bringing the damp city air and the sharp scent of Tom Ford cologne with him. He hadn't been Alexandra's lover then, or perhaps he already was, and the deception had merely begun to take root. David shed his camel hair overcoat, revealing a perfectly tailored, charcoal worsted wool suit. He didn't sit in the waiting area. He walked straight to Hunter's station, bypassing 2 other available barbers. "Evening, Hunter. Squeeze me in for a cleanup," David asked. It wasn't a request. It was a casual command from a man who believed the world operated on his schedule. Hunter pumped the hydraulic pedal, lowering the vintage Belmont chair. "Always Mr. Miller." As Hunter draped the pinstriped nylon cape over David's shoulders, fixing the tissue strip around his neck, the psychological theater began. David leaned back, catching Alexandra's reflection in the massive wall mirror. "Alexandra, isn't it?" David smiled, a smooth, practice a curve of the lips. "Hunter's better half. I recognized you from the marketing firm's holiday party photos." Alexandra looked up startled, then immediately smoothed her posture, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "Yes. Hello, David." Hunter picked up his shears. He focused on the damp hair at the nape of David's neck, his movements precise and mechanical. "I was just telling my partners today," David continued, his voice resonating from his chest, entirely ignoring Hunter, who was working mere inches from his ear, about the sheer endurance it takes to stand behind a chair all day. "You must have the patience of a saint, Hunter. I lose my mind if a board meeting runs past 2 hours. "It's a honest work," Hunter replied softly, the comb gliding through the dark hair. "Oh, absolutely," David said, chuckling. He shifted his gaze back to Alexandra in the mirror. "But it must be tough on you, Alexandra. The hours, I mean. The limited upside. I was telling a colleague, you can't buy back youth. I took a client to St. Bart's last winter just to escape the Chicago freeze. Where are you two heading for your anniversary?" Hunter's hand paused for a fraction of a second. They had planned a weekend drive up to Wisconsin, staying at a budget bed and breakfast near the lake. It was all they could afford. "We're keeping it local this year," Alexandra said. Her voice was light, but Hunter caught the micro-expression in the mirror, the slight tightening of her jaw, the sudden shameful drop of her eyes down to her magazine. It was a look of profound, agonizing inadequacy. "Ah, local, very practical," David murmured. He tilted his head back against the leather rest as Hunter applied the steaming hot towel, shutting his eyes with a satisfied sigh. "Practicality is a virtue, I suppose. Just not a very exciting one." Under the heavy, wet heat of the towel, David Miller was completely vulnerable. Hunter held the straight razor, the carbon steel resting lightly against his thumb. One slip, one tremor of anger, and he could open the man's throat. But Hunter only shaved the lathered stubble with expert, smooth strokes, swallowing the bitter taste of humiliation. He was a servant in his own life, forced to groom the man who was silently purchasing his wife's respect right in front of him. Hunter opened his eyes, the memory fading as the sleek lines of his corporate office reformed around him. He looked down at his clean, manicured hands resting on the mahogany desk. He didn't have a razor anymore. He had a fountain pen. And this time he was going to bleed David Miller dry. The rain hit the towering windows of the Lake Forest estate, not in drops, but in harsh, violent sheets, sounding like handfuls of gravel thrown against the glass. It was past midnight, but the grand house blazed with a cold, unnatural brightness. Every light in David's study was switched on, casting sharp, unforgiving shadows across the room. Alexandra stood paralyzed in the doorway, her silk robe pulled tightly around her waist. The study, usually a sanctuary of curated leather and mahogany, looked as though it had been ransacked. Heavy drawers from the antique desk were pulled entirely out, their contents dumped onto the Persian rug. Folders, ledgers, and bank statements formed a chaotic sea of white paper across the floor. In the center of the wreckage stood David. He was stripped of his suit jacket and tie, the top buttons of his shirt torn open. His chest heaved with erratic, shallow breaths, and the veins in his neck stood out like thick cords. "Where is it?" David's voice was a ragged, guttural rasp, unrecognizable from the smooth baritone that used to command boardrooms and barber chairs. He aggressively kicked a pile of tax documents aside. "The mail from Tuesday, Alexandra. The certified envelope. Where the hell did you put it?" The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The memory of the thick white envelope buried beneath the recycling flashed behind her eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about," she lied, her voice paper-thin. David stopped moving. He slowly turned to face her, his eye bloodshot and wide with a terrifying feral panic. "Don't play stupid. Not tonight. My broker called. The accounts are frozen. The firm locked me out of the server at 5 o'clock. They're initiating a fire sale to cover the margin calls. I need the notice from the holding bank to see how much time we have to list the house before they move on the deed." He stepped closer, his tailored shoes crunching over the scattered papers. "Tell me you didn't throw it away. Tell me you aren't that incompetent." The insult, sharp and sudden, snapped something fragile within Alexandra. The subservient, supportive mask she had worn for 5 years cracked perfectly in half. "Incompetent?" She fired back, her voice rising above the sound of the rain. "You have been lying to me for months. You promised me security. You paraded me around your country club, dripping in diamonds you apparently bought with phantom money. And now you're calling me incompetent." "I bought you exactly what you asked for," David roared, the sheer volume vibrating against the wood paneling. He closed the distance between them, pointing a trembling finger at her face. "Don't pretend you were blind to the harm. You wanted the house. You wanted the cars. You left that pathetic barber because he couldn't give you the life you felt entitled to. I built this entire empire to keep you satisfied, and it bled me dry." "You didn't build an empire, David," she spat, her tone dripping with venomous clarity as she looked at the broken man before her. "You built a house of cards, and you hid the collapse because your ego couldn't handle the failure." She took a slow, deliberate step backward, putting distance between herself and the desperate stranger she had married. "You want to know where the bank notice is? It's in the recycling bin. They aren't giving us time to list the house. It's already in foreclosure. We have nothing." The words hung in the suffocating air. David's arm dropped slowly to his side. The frantic energy drained from him, leaving behind only the hollow gray shell of a ruined man. He looked around the massive, expensive room, realizing it no longer belonged to him. The bitter truth settled between them like a physical wall. Their love had never been a partnership. It was a transaction, and tonight the check had finally bounced. The imposing steel and glass atrium of Apex Capital Solutions was designed to make visitors feel insignificantly small. Located in the heart of the financial district, the building hummed with the quiet, ruthless energy of money-changing hands. The air smelled of ozone-polished granite and expensive corporate air conditioning. Alexandra sat rigidly on the edge of an angular black leather sofa in the reception area. She had dressed with meticulous, almost frantic care that morning. She wore a tailored St. John knit suit, her Cartier watch secured tightly around her wrist, and her hair blown out to perfection. It was an armor of affluence, a desperate attempt to project the image of a woman experiencing a minor administrative error rather than a wife on the brink of total destitution. She clutched a leather portfolio tightly against her knees. Inside were bank statements, a list of David's supposedly liquidating assets, and a drafted plea for a 90-day extension on the foreclosure proceedings. David had refused to come, locking himself in his study with another bottle of scotch, leaving her to face the executioners alone. Every time the silver doors of the elevator bank chimed, Alexandra flinched slightly. She checked her phone, the screen blank, then smoothed an invisible crease on her skirt. Her throat was terribly dry. 50 feet above her, separated by a mezzanine and a pane of soundproof one-way acoustic glass, Hunter Anderson stood perfectly still. He held a ceramic cup of black coffee, the steam rising in the chilled air of his private office. He looked down at the lobby floor, his gaze locked entirely on the small, perfectly dressed figure sitting on the sofa. From this vantage point, she looked exactly as she had 5 years ago, beautiful, poised entirely out of his league. But the angle of the narrative had violently shifted. Hunter watched her cross her legs, uncross them, and bite the inside of her lower lip. It was a nervous tell she had always exhibited when her mother called to complain or when a credit card was unexpectedly declined at a restaurant. He knew the rhythm of her anxiety intimately. For years, his instinct had been to reach out, to place a calming hand on her shoulder and assure her he would fix it. Now his hand remained wrapped around his coffee cup. He felt no surge of triumph, no adrenaline spike. There was only a cold, heavy, absolute certainty settling into his bones. She had come to his sanctuary to beg for the life she had built with the man who humiliated him. She was sitting in the fortress he had constructed from the ashes of their marriage, entirely oblivious to the fact that the invisible CEO she was waiting to grovel to was the husband she had thrown away. The intercom on his mahogany desk chimed with a soft, polite beep. "Mr. Anderson," his assistant's voice filtered through the speaker. "Mrs. Miller is in the lobby regarding the North Shore distressed portfolio. She's asking to speak with the senior asset manager." Hunter did not take his eyes off Alexandra. He watched her speak to the receptionist, her posture leaning forward to the subtle, desperate tilt of her head, attempting to leverage a charm that no longer held any currency here. Hunter pressed a button on the console. His voice was flat, devoid of any inflection. "Send her up to conference room B on the 40th floor. And keep her waiting there for exactly 20 minutes before you let me know." He released the button and took a slow sip of his coffee. Below, the receptionist gestured toward the elevator. Alexandra stood up, adjusting her suit jacket, bracing herself to face the unknown. Hunter watched the silver doors slide shut, swallowing her whole, knowing exactly what was waiting for her at the top. Conference room B was a masterpiece of intimidation. Suspended 40 floors above the city, its walls were sheer glass, offering a dizzying, omniscient view of the Chicago skyline. Alexandra had been sitting in the ergonomic mesh chair for exactly 22 minutes. The silence in the room was absolute, heavily insulated from the chaos of the streets below. A single glass of ice water sweated onto a slate coaster in front of her. She rehearsed her opening statement in her head for the 100th time. "We have liquid assets tied up in escrow. A temporary forbearance is mutually beneficial to the institution and the client." She sounded like David. The thought made her stomach twist in a cold knot. The sudden heavy click of the frosted glass door opening sent a violent jolt down her spine. Alexandra stood up immediately, smoothing the front of her St. John's suit, pasting on the professional, slightly contrite smile she had perfected for country club apologies. "Thank you so much for taking the time to—" The words died in her throat. The sound was cut off so abruptly it was as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked from the room. The man who walked through the door did not wear the standard unassuming Navy uniform of a mid-level asset manager. He wore a charcoal double-breasted suit cut with a precision that whispered of Savile Row. His stride was measured unhurried, commanding the massive space the second he crossed the threshold. He carried a single slim leather folder. It was Hunter. Alexandra couldn't breathe. Her vision narrowed the edges of the room, blurring into static. Her mind violently rejected the visual information it was receiving. Hunter, that man who swept hair off checkered linoleum floors. The man she had abandoned in a cramped Logan Square walk-up with a fading canvas bag. The man whose working-class status David used to casually mock while she poured them expensive wine. He didn't look angry. He didn't look broken. He looked completely and terrifyingly transformed. The soft, accommodating lines of his face had hardened into something carved from granite. Hunter didn't immediately look at her. He walked to the head of the long walnut table, pulled out the leather executive chair opposite hers, and sat down. He placed the folder precisely in the center of the table, his manicured hands resting lightly on the cover. Only then did he raise his eyes to meet hers. The impact of his gaze was a physical blow. There was no warmth, no residual hurt, no flicker of the man who used to make her coffee every morning. It was the detached, clinical stare of an apex predator observing a trapped animal. "Sit down, Alexandra," he said. His voice was exactly the same, the low, even baritone she remembered, but the cadence was entirely alien. It carried a quiet, absolute authority that made her knees instinctively buckle. She collapsed back into her chair, her trembling hands gripping the armrests until her knuckles turned white. Her meticulously planned defense, the financial jargon, the practiced charm, it all dissolved into ash. She was stripped entirely bare, reduced instantly to the guilty woman who had left a good man for a counterfeit life. "Hunter," she whispered the name tearing at her dry throat. I don't understand. What are you doing here?" Hunter slowly opened the leather folder. The stark white paper inside bore the identical, brutal typography of the foreclosure notice she had buried beneath the magazines in her kitchen. "Apex Capital Solutions recently acquired a block of distressed assets from your primary lender," Hunter said smoothly, his eyes dropping to the document. He tapped the page with a silver fountain pen. "I am the majority stakeholder of Apex, which means, Alexandra, that I own the debt on the Lake Forest estate." He looked back up, holding her wide, terrified stare. The silence in the room stretched out cold and merciless, threatening to snap her sanity. "I believe you requested an extension," he stated softly. The air in conference room B grew so dense it felt difficult to inhale. Alexandra stared at the silver fountain pen resting near Hunter's fingertips. The reality of the situation crashed over her in suffocating waves. Hunter wasn't just wealthy. He was the silent architect, holding the blueprint to her destruction. "An extension." Alexandra White repeated, her voice a hollow, trembling whisper. "Hunter, please, you know David. He just needs a little time to liquidate a few key assets." "David is completely insolvent," Hunter interrupted. He didn't raise his voice yet, the words struck like physical blows. "He leveraged your estate to cover massive margin calls, hiding the debt in offshore shell accounts. The house has been effectively underwater for 6 months. There is no liquidation payout coming, Alexandra. Only an auction block." Alexandra slumped slightly, the remaining fight draining from her rigid posture. The veneer of the successful, upper-class wife melted away entirely, leaving a terrified woman staring at the abyss of poverty. She looked at Hunter, desperately searching his face for any remnant of the gentle man who used to kiss her forehead before leaving for his shift at the barbershop. She found nothing but polished stone. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, tears finally brimming in her eyes. "You could have just let the bank take it. Why buy the debt? Why bring me up here?" Hunter leaned back in his chair, the rich leather creaking softly in the quiet room. "I didn't bring you here to negotiate, Alexandra. I brought you here to establish the terms of your surrender." He slid a single sheet of paper across the smooth walnut table. It stopped precisely an inch from her trembling hands. "The standard foreclosure procedure dictates a public auction, immediate eviction by the sheriff's department, and the freezing of any remaining joint assets to satisfy the deficit." Hunter stated, his tone clinically detached. "However, I can offer a private deed in lieu of foreclosure. You will have 48 hours to pack your personal belongings and vacate the premises quietly. No sirens, no public spectacle in front of your country club neighbors. I will even waive the pursuit of the deficiency judgment against you personally." Alexandra stared at the paper. It was a lifeline, but it was heavily coated in poison. 48 hours, she would leave with nothing but the clothes in her closet. And what do you want in exchange? Hunter rested his elbows on the table, clasping his hands together. The truth. She swallowed hard, her throat burning. The truth. 5 years ago, you didn't leave a note. You didn't offer a single word of explanation. Hunter said, his eyes locking onto hers, stripping away every psychological defense she possessed. You let me walk out into the cold because you were too much of a coward to admit what you were doing. If you want this grace period, if you want to avoid the humiliation of your neighbors watching your life thrown onto the lawn, I want you to say it now. Hunter, don't do this. Say it, he commanded softly, the quiet intensity of his voice far more terrifying than a shout. Tell me exactly why you let David Miller into your bed while I was standing on my feet 10 hours a day to pay our rent. Tell me what you traded me for. The silence in the room stretched to the breaking point. The distant, muffled wail of an ambulance echoed from the city streets far below. Alexandra looked down at her hands, the heavy Cartier watch, suddenly feeling like a shackle. The shame burned through her chest, hot and suffocating. Because he had money, she whispered, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a hot path down her pale cheek. Because I hated our apartment. Because I wanted to be somebody, and I thought his wealth would make me real. She choked on a sob, looking up at him with devastated, broken eyes. I traded a good man for a lie because I was greedy. Hunter watched her break. He absorbed the words he had waited half a decade to hear. But as the confession hung in the sterile, conditioned air of the boardroom, he realized the victory tasted entirely like ash. He picked up his pen, signed the document with a fluid motion, and pushed it toward her. You have 48 hours, Alexandra. The drive back to Lake Forest was a blur of gray concrete and red taillights. Alexandra gripped the leather steering wheel of her Mercedes until her hands cramped, but she couldn't feel the luxury of the vehicle anymore. It felt like a borrowed coffin. When she pulled into the circular driveway, the house was dark, save for the harsh fluorescent glare spilling from the master bedroom on the second floor. She walked through the grand foyer, the silence pressing against her eardrums. The document bearing Hunter's signature felt like a lead weight in her designer handbag. 48 hours. The clock had already started ticking. She climbed the sweeping staircase, her legs heavy. David, she called out, her voice echoing faintly in the cavernous space. She found him in the master suite. The massive walk-in closet was torn apart. 3 large Rimowa suitcases lay open on the custom velvet ottoman. David was methodically folding tailored shirts and placing them inside alongside a stack of heavy leather-bound portfolios. He didn't look up when she entered. David, what are you doing? She asked, stopping in the doorway. I'm leaving, he stated simply, his tone utterly devoid of emotion. It wasn't the frantic panic of the previous night. It was cold, calculated survival. My attorney called an hour ago. The SEC is looking into the offshore shell accounts. If I stay here, they'll freeze my passport by Monday. I have a flight to Zurich at 9 p.m. Alexandra stared at the open suitcases, her mind struggling to process the sheer velocity of his betrayal. Zurich? And what about the house? What about me? David paused, a perfectly folded silk tie in his hand. He finally looked at her, and the absolute emptiness in his eyes made her physically recoil. There was no love, no guilt, no shared history. He was looking at a depreciating asset. There is no house, Alexandra. The bank owns it, he said, turning back to his packing. And as for you, you're a smart woman. You'll figure it out. You always do. I went to the holding firm, she whispered, her voice trembling. The words tasted like blood. I begged for an extension. The CEO of Apex Capital. It's Hunter. David's hands stopped. For a fraction of a second, the name hung in the air, a ghost from a past he had thought he buried with his wallet. Then he let out a short, hollow laugh. Hunter, the barber. Of course it is. The universe loves a bad joke. He zipped the first suitcase closed with a sharp, violent sound. Well, that confirms it. He's not going to show mercy. He's going to burn us to the ground, which is exactly why I'm not staying to watch. You're just going to leave me here? She asked, the tears she had held back in Hunter's office finally spilling over. After everything I gave up for you, you promised me a life, David. You promised me security. David grabbed the handle of the luggage and hoisted it onto the floor. He walked over to her, his face inches from hers. You didn't give anything up for me, Alexandra. You traded up, and now the market has crashed. Don't act like a victim when you willingly signed the contract. He stepped around her, pulling the suitcase down the hallway. Alexandra didn't follow him. She stood frozen in the center of the devastated closet, listening to the rhythmic thump of the wheels descending the stairs. Then came the heavy thud of the front door, followed seconds later by the roar of his engine fading into the night. The sprawling estate was finally truly silent. She was entirely alone, surrounded by clothes she couldn't afford in a house she no longer owned, at the absolute mercy of the husband she had broken. She sank to the floor, her back against the cold mirrored glass of the closet doors, as the remaining 46 hours began to bleed away. The 48th hour arrived with the bleak gray light of a Chicago autumn morning. The sprawling Lake Forest estate, once a fortress of curated perfection, had been stripped of its soul. Without the soft glow of the ambient lighting or the meticulous arrangements of fresh flowers, the massive rooms felt cavernous and profoundly dead. Alexandra stood in the grand foyer wearing a simple wool coat and a pair of faded denim jeans she hadn't worn since her days in the Logan Square apartment. At her feet sat two medium-sized suitcases and a cardboard box containing a few framed photographs and vital documents. It was the absolute sum of her existence. David had vanished into the ether of international airspace, the banks had frozen the remaining accounts, and her social circle had evaporated the moment the whispers of insolvency began. She was entirely erased. Through the sidelight window, she watched a sleek black town car glide into the circular driveway, the tires crunching softly against the white gravel. Hunter stepped out. He wore a heavy charcoal overcoat against the biting wind, his expression unreadable behind the sharp planes of his face. He walked up the stone steps with the measured, unhurried pace of a man who owned the ground beneath his feet. Alexandra opened the heavy oak door before he could ring the bell. She didn't want to hear the chime. She didn't want to pretend he was a guest. They stood on the threshold, the cold wind sweeping between them, carrying the scent of dying leaves. There were no tears left to cry. The frantic panic of the last 2 days had burned out, leaving Alexandra with nothing but a hollow, vibrating exhaustion. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the heavy brass key. Her hand trembled slightly as she held it out. Hunter looked at the key, then up at her face. He saw the dark circles bruised beneath her eyes, the sharp, fragile line of her jaw. She looked remarkably small, stripped of the armor of her wealth, reduced back to the woman he had married, yet entirely broken. He took the key. Their fingers did not touch. The metal was freezing. The alarm code is deactivated. Alexandra said, her voice a dry, papery whisper. The utilities are scheduled to transfer to the holding company at noon. Understood, Hunter replied. The single word hung in the frigid air, thick with finality. Alexandra picked up her box. She didn't offer an apology. Words were entirely useless currency now. She walked past him down the stone steps toward the modest rental car waiting at the curb. Hunter did not turn to watch her go. He listened to the engine start, the tires pulling away until the sound was swallowed entirely by the wind. He turned and stepped into the house, closing the heavy door behind him. The lock engaged with a loud, echoing click. Hunter stood in the center of the foyer. He walked slowly through the house, his leather shoes tapping a solitary rhythm against the imported hardwood. He passed the custom kitchen, the expansive sunroom, and finally stepped into the ruined master closet where David had packed his escape. The air smelled of expensive dust, stale scotch, and abandonment. He ran his hand along the cold edge of a marble countertop. For 5 years, this exact moment had been the engine driving his every waking hour. He had built an empire from his grief, fully believing that the day he stood inside the wreckage of her consequence, the agonizing weight in his chest would finally lift. But as the silence of the massive empty house pressed against his eardrums, the truth settled into his bones like frost. The revenge was complete. Her life was utterly destroyed, and yet the hollow space behind his ribs remained perfectly intact. He realized with a quiet, sickening clarity that purchasing the graveyard of his dead marriage had not brought him back to life. It had only made him the caretaker of the ruins. The following Monday, the Apex Capital Solutions boardroom was bathed in the crisp, pragmatic light of early afternoon. Hunter sat at the head of the walnut table, a single manila folder resting before him. Sean Murphy stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the Chicago skyline. The Lake Forest property is officially vacant, Sean said, turning back to the room. The locks have been changed and the deed is fully transferred to Apex. We have 2 aggressive buyers ready to place bids before it even hits the public auction block. Hunter looked at the folder. Inside was the final signed surrender document from Alexandra. It was the physical culmination of 5 years of relentless silent fury. He had expected to feel a surge of absolute triumph, the exhilarating high of a debt fully collected. Instead, he felt only a profound, quiet exhaustion. The ghost of his broken marriage had been finally exorcised, but the house it haunted was still empty. "List it," Hunter said, his voice steady and remarkably light. "Sell it to the highest bidder by Friday and dump the proceeds into the new commercial development fund. I don't want that property sitting on our books for another week." Sean raised an eyebrow, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. "Liquidating the trophy already, I thought you might want to keep it as a monument." Hunter picked up the folder, walked over to the heavy industrial shredder in the corner of the room, and fed the document into the churning blades. He watched the paper dissolve into meaningless strips. "A monument is just a tombstone for something that's already dead, Sean," Hunter replied, turning away from the machine. "I spent 5 years trying to balance a ledger that was broken the moment she made her choice. The debt is paid." He walked out of the boardroom, leaving the shredded remnants of his past behind. Stepping onto the elevator, the silver doors closed, reflecting a man who was no longer defined by the woman who betrayed him, nor by the vengeance he had wrought. The descent was smooth, and when the doors opened to the bustling lobby below, Hunter Anderson stepped out into the city light, finally free.